Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I see we are almost at 100 people now. We've started the meeting, so I'm just going to run through the ground rules, and then I'll do a short introduction and hand over to our esteemed colleague at Treasury Board. So, just a reminder of the three house rules for today, please. Please keep your microphone on mute. Please try not to use the video function, as this will impact the potential presentation. And as I've advertised, if you do want to ask questions, please use the chat box function, as that's the way we will hopefully get through as many of those questions. There are a few of us in the admin role that are looking at those questions to try and group to them and try and answer as many as we can after we go through this webinar. So they are the kind of the ground rules. So I will do a short introduction. So first of all, thank you very much for almost 100 people that have shown an interest in costing in the government of Canada. This is excellent. This is really exciting. I thank you straight up to Derek Pokiak, Jason Hambry, and of course Roger from the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, who have worked with myself at ICEAA Canada to bring forward a webinar. And the purpose of the webinar today is really to kind of provide an update around costing in the government of Canada. I have personally seen an increase in the interest and an increase in the applications of the discipline of costing through the work that I do and through my role at ICEAA Canada. And I'm always very, very keen that we are able to cost projects, initiatives, programs in a very consistent and measured way. One of the ways to ensure that is that we work very, very closely with the experts within our Canadian government sector. And for those that may not know, the Treasury Board of Canada has its own costing centre of expertise, and they are very much involved in bringing a level of thought pieces, some learnings, and some guidance in order to sort of sustain that level of consistency, that level of approach. And going beyond that, we're really, really happy today to bring the Assistant Comptroller General, Roger Ermuth, today, who will actually walk through a presentation and provide a view of where costing is going, and provide some input of some of the resources that are available. And for me, this is an excellent opportunity because, one, it will bring a lot of people together to focus on one thing, and it'll also provide a network. And one of the things that ICEAA is trying to promote in conjunction that is to build up a costing community of practice amongst those that are on the call, within your organizations, and within that. So that's the kind of introduction I wanted to provide. One last plug, please do use the chat on the right hand side. Please feel free to ask the questions. We will monitor them as we're going through, and we will hopefully have sort of 20 minutes at the end to kind of open them up and learning, because I'm sure that will be as valuable as the presentation that we're going to go through. So that's it from me from introduction. I'll hand over the virtual mic to Roger. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Daniel. You can hear me all right?
We certainly can, loud and clear.
And do you want to see me, or are you just as happy not to?
I think we're lovely to see you there, Roger. So please keep your video on.
I put on my lumberjack shirt to match my my backdrop here. But first of all, thank you very much to you guys for inviting us. And you know, I see closer to 110 it looks like now with the numbers there of people here, which is really phenomenal. And you know, hats off to the work of ICEAA and the work that you guys have been doing. And of course, as Danielle probably knows, and I saw Peter Weldon was on this call as well, going back, Government of Canada, Mike Leonet, Peter Weldon, were instrumental in sort of starting up ICEAA back about 6 years ago now, I guess. So very happy to see it grow from a very small group to a Canadian chapter to 100 people attending a seminar. So, je parlerai en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions, on peut parler en français aussi. My understanding is that for now we're going to do this in English, but if, as I said, if there's anyone who has any questions in French, we can also do that. I do want to introduce and thank Jason Hambry, who's a senior policy analyst with our costing, charging, and transfer payment division, who, when it really gets down to the nitty gritty of what we're doing, I'm going to turn over to him, and instead I'll focus on a bit of an overview and a bit of a history. So first of all, a little bit about myself. So I am the Assistant Controller General in the financial management sector, working under the Controller General for the Government of Canada. So Rakupé is my boss. In terms of my costing experience, I guess I go back to when I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers doing some costing associated with the Firearms Center, CRA pay consolidation well before there was a Phoenix. Back in those days when I wanted to figure out what I had to do with costing, I'm sure some of you would remember Gary Koken's Costing 101 book is what sort of where I got my start. Went on different jobs in the government doing project work, a lot around costing. I was with the Administrative Services Review that created Shared Service Canada, did, I guess some would argue maybe it wasn't well done, but did the costing supporting the creation of that. And then in around 2012, got asked to be the first executive director, so director general of the Costing Center of Expertise. 2014, around that was. And then about a year later, moved up to this role. So I think what I'm trying to say with that introduction is I'll acknowledge the fact that I know enough in costing to be dangerous, enough to drive my team probably crazy because I pretend to know as much as they do. But I'll also tell you, as you'll see as we go through the presentation, costing has moved along significantly in the Government of Canada to the point where the folks who are here, including folks like Jason, are the true experts and are really the ones who you'll want to hear from for some of that detailed information. In terms of the second slide, I wanted to again just give you a bit of an overview of the government direction. I do want to again acknowledge how proud I am with what the team has accomplished. And where we have gone from when we started off, prior to the creation of the Costing Center, I was responsible for basically 2 costers in the central agency for the Government of Canada to the point now where we have a team of well over a dozen highly skilled, sophisticated costers who are continuing to retool and learn new things. There's been lots of hard work. Many challenges are still to face. In terms of the third slide, a little bit of an evolution. So just around the time when I started with Treasury Board Secretariat, the F-35 cost estimate review was being done. And what had happened was PBO and National Defence were both saying how much it was going to cost for the F-35s. There was a little bit of a difference in terms of some of the base assumptions for years of service, et cetera. And what became obvious was, despite the fact that there was quite a bit of outcry, which is why KPMG was brought in to actually do a review, National Defence had not misled Parliament, had not misled Canadians. But what they were doing was they're telling a slightly different story than what PBO. And I think that is probably one of the biggest lessons that I learned. And it was, my first couple of months on the job, is the importance of the communication around some of these big endeavors. Fast forward a couple of years to 2014, F-35 was still a big discussion, and there was, I guess, through some correspondence, through some challenges with the government of the day, a desire to create a costing center. So the Costing Center of Expertise within the Government of Canada was actually created from a letter from the Prime Minister. And he basically wanted to see costing and his ability to rely on that information increase. One of the big challenges is I think the system, as soon as the Costing Center was created, assumed that meant we turned a magical key and costs were from that point forward bang on, smartly done. There was no issues, and so on. And of course, for those of you who have lived this journey with us, you know that along the way there was a lot of hard work, a lot of learning, a lot of collaborating, a lot of mistakes, but at the same time, we were eventually able to continue to move that forward. One of the things, and I'll talk about it in a little bit as well, that became a really key component is that CFO attestation piece. So right now, and starting in the 2014-15 timeframe, we launched what we call our CFO attestation, which is a formalized approach for CFOs to sign off on cabinet submissions. Most importantly, what that did is it actually moved the CFO back into the organization, back into the program areas to make sure that they were engaged and were involved in the development of the financial information, policy, et cetera, risks, but also involved in and had an ability to influence some of the costing that would go in. A couple of years later, we engaged a firm called Kinetic and did a review in terms of what's our capacity. And we looked at the 3 or 4 largest organizations who were doing costing, the best of which was maybe around midpoint in terms of capacity. So we knew we had challenges in terms of building that. We also knew that it was going to take a fair amount of time. So we hunkered down and continued to work through focus, and I'll talk a little bit more in a bit too about people, data, tools, and process in terms of how did we grow our system larger. From 2016 to 2018, and actually I would say it's even ongoing now, is we launched our national shipbuilding strategy. As many of you will be aware, there's a lot of news around the national shipbuilding strategies. We build capacity in Canada, as well as just the rollout of these massive capital infrastructure projects. And the pilot was, the idea behind the pilot was to make sure the decision makers were provided with more timely, regular, rigorous financial information. It also included, probably one of the biggest things, an annual update on costing. Typically, what we did before then, and probably still do on a number of projects, is, they only come forward for a cabinet discussion at certain critical junctures, which could be 3 years, 5 years, and in that period, a fair amount could have happened. So, given the scale and scope, and quite frankly, bottom line of these things, from 2016, 2018, for sure, we were doing these annual updates. Where we are to today is continuing our emphasis on costing guidance and training. And I think one of the things that the team would tell you is that the work that we've been doing in building the capacity has come at the expense of some of the training and guidance and outreach that we need to do. But it's sort of hard with a team of only just slightly over a dozen folks. I think, in terms of, just to conclude on this slide, I think my biggest lesson was, first of all, the creation of the costing center on its own did not equal better cost estimation, which was a hard discussion in the first few years. Staffing up and training and working with great, competent people led to better cost estimates, but it didn't reduce the uncertainty and didn't reduce some of the challenges associated with it. As we staffed up, got better cost estimating training, et cetera, worked on the communication, worked on the language around how we actually communicate and explain things, there was a greater understanding of why things were changing, acknowledging the fact that, of course, there's always going to be changes as a result of as things that are uncertain become clear and have an impact, or things that were unforeseen all of a sudden pop in. I think the key message too, though, from this is that it's important to disclose the level of risk, and the risk approach is, I think, critical to what it is we've been doing. Next slide, please. In terms of the cost, the context for achieving results through costing, so the cost value proposition. The foundation, of course, is people, data, tools, and again, the right people understanding what they need to do, having the right amount of data, both in terms of the data from the project, data from other sources, benchmarking data, tools, statistical, analytical, benchmarking databases, etc., to be able to do that. Government of Canada costing process. So then having the right process, making sure that along the way, cost estimations are informed and informing along the right path as a cost estimate or as a proposal is going forward, leading to that credible cost information. And I think when Jason talks in a few more slides, he'll talk about the importance of the robustness and the credibility of the cost information, which is really what we're getting down to. So we still may have conversations with certain departments and say, we know your costs aren't super strong right now because it's way too far out. It's brand new. You don't know what you don't know even. But we acknowledge the fact that you are working on it, you're building the capacity, you're looking at it, and we will say that there's a challenge with that. As time goes on, as things become better known, there's an expectation that as the costing capacity increases, as the project knowledge increases, again, that this would become better. Leading on, of course, to realistic budgets and sound contingency management. It's very difficult when you're, and folks here should be well aware of the difference between a cost estimate and a budget. And of course, those things sometimes blur, especially when it in a large public endeavor. It starts to become a bit of a communication challenge. And then, of course, linkages back to the results, which has been so key with the last few years in the federal government. In terms of the CCA work with departments and agencies to strengthen costing capacity, I do have to give a huge shout out to National Defence, and in particular Alan. Sorry, Alan. I keep calling you Peter Weldon. I don't know why I was doing that. To Alan Weldon. And the work that he and his team did, I think, and again, I could look at Derek Pokiak and some of the other folks who've been around for a long time. We really grew up the two organizations together. Doesn't mean that it was always, it's almost like siblings. We sometimes didn't agree and sometimes jostled a bit, but at the end of the day, we always came together. And I think through that, we've been able to really move along the system around, especially the national defense procurement. As we start looking at IMIT costing, I think there's a bit of a path there, and thanks to again our colleagues at Defense, we're ready to take some lessons learned and move forward. Next slide, please. So, challenge has been since the beginning, and I can remember this, as we were before we even launched the costing center, was who is the costing center for? What is it going to do? How are we going to support the different needs? And the challenge is that there, in general, are three groups of broad categories of folks who are going to be doing costing. They're the generalists. Of course, like the generalists are a much higher level. They may do it a little bit here and there. We get into some of the practitioners who, of course, are doing this more often and looking at the specifics on actually cost estimation and understanding that. And then, of course, you get into the specialists. And I can tell you, in the early days, there weren't very many, if any, specialists. Might have been a few kicking around at National Defense, and we might have had a couple at TBS. The trouble with building guidance is, first of all, we don't have time for it because all the work goes into actually supporting departments and looking at cases. The other thing is that people move from one category to the other, or departments move from one category to another, and then back and forth and up and down. So if you're doing a major capital lab refit or accommodation, how often do you do that? Versus we built some across the St. Lawrence bridges. Hadn't done those in many years, right? 30 years or something like that. So what we've done is we're trying to break out and trying to look at how we support these groups differently. Again, generalists with some degree of understanding, and I'll cover in the next slide a little bit more. But the TB guide to costing. So we have a guide that's posted on our webpage to support, again, just high level. So you take a cost accountant and you give them a little bit of extra support, and I actually put myself into that category, and we can do enough to sort of pull together and make things look like they make sense. Practitioners have a greater understanding of the core principles. cost estimation, and then are really getting more into those credible cost estimations in terms of like the support, the more advanced data tools and so on. And then the specialists are really niche and understanding costing in their domain. And this is one of the discussions we're having now with some of the IMIT projects around town is, although national defense has some absolutely top-notch costers in the national defense or in the defense procurement space, the ability to take those people and overnight can turn them into the ability to run a 50 million, 100 million, 250 million, whatever it is, project takes some time, and it's those specialists are really into their niche areas. The next slide, please, just goes into a little bit more on some of the specifics around costing. So for the generalist, again, the guide to costing, which according to my notes here, has at least in the last 3-4 years, the last 5 years has gone through at least 3 major revisions as we've looked at how to best serve that community. And I would say this is probably one of the areas where we need to focus a little bit more is on the generalists. We've talked in the past about program costing. We've talked about challenges with the definitions around rough order of magnitude, indicative and substantive costing, building in the ideas of the confidence and the risk-based cost estimates, etc. The practitioners, we have in terms of you can see here some stuff that's done, cost breakdown structures, inflation, etc. And you can see a bit of a forward plan there. All of these things, of course, are critical to making sure that we have robust cost estimates, again, for that practitioner level. And then that becomes informed and supports what we do in the more specialized work, which, quite frankly, I think, and Derek at some point, Derek Polkiak could challenge me on this a little bit, but I think we still have some challenges here. We've developed an annex that would go with some of the cabinet submissions that give a bit more insight that support the costing center that we have at Treasury Board Secretariat. But there's a lot of work, and I know his team has dabbled in EVM, looking at advanced risk and uncertainty analysis, and as I mentioned earlier, even getting into some of the IMIT costing and pushing the boundaries a little bit more on infrastructure. I just close on this slide again, sort of to those folks who are from the Federal Public Service, sort of saying, I think we've to a certain extent been a victim of our own success, which is we keep getting pulled more and more into some of the analytics, and as a result, we've probably fallen down a little bit on some of the guidance, and there is some work to do there. And of course, for the specialists, one of the things we do rely on is Danielle and the rest of the folks at ICEAA and some of the information that you guys can bring to bear to support the work that we're doing. In terms of the training on the next slide, I think training is another area which sort of flows from our guidance, and keeping in mind that we've been building this costing center now for about 6 years. The work that we need to do to land our guidance will have a direct impact on the training. And again, at the top end, I think we're very well served by ICEAA, some of the international costing organizations. We also have some work that we can do with CPA Canada, with the Financial Management Institute, as well as costing from time to time. Going back in, again, start at the other end. Departments have some internal metrics that they would use, or guidelines, training of how they're going to do their submissions, varying degrees of capacity. Again, I think some of the more advanced, like National Defense, PSPC, DFO, are probably a little bit further ahead. But for the rest, I think it fits within the context of that department. We did have and started some work with SSC in terms of trying to take some of their departmental training and move it to the next middle column there, which is the Government of Canada training related to IMIT costing. And I guess discussions are still ongoing. It's stalled a little bit just with everything else that's been going on with COVID and all the rest of the work that's going on. We do have a course through the Canada School. I think there's lots of opportunity to probably develop and roll out more costing, but again, it comes down to a budget issue. In terms of outreach, on the next slide, I guess our current method right now of outreach is through our GCpedia site, which is an internal Government of Canada webpage to support the community of practice. We have put a little more effort in the last little bit back into getting the community of practice costing practitioners sort of coming together. And that will continue, and we'll try and again keep that as a good forum for discussion. Again, with 12 people, it's a small but mighty group. But when we expand that across departments, there's actually a lot of knowledge and quite frankly, a lot of the expertise that we should be trying to leverage and capture to share best practices sit out in the broader organizations. ICEAA, again, key partner in bringing all of the outreach together, things like this where there are opportunities. And I truly believe, and if any of you have heard me speak on some of the financial management community side of my day job, I'm extremely big on the community and bringing together folks to have the conversations, to build a network, to again leverage what it is that we have each as individual organizations, individuals, to the broader context. Within the international community, again, huge supporter of ICEAA, and we've been there since the beginning. GAO, early on, we had quite a bit of involvement with the US as well. And I think we need to continue to work with and collaborate, and ICEAA becomes a great conduit for international exposure and discussions as we go forward. So the next slide, just before I turn over to Jason. So I've talked a little bit about almost our policy or our capacity building side of what we need to do, and there's obviously a lot of that's extremely important. But I wanted to shift for a slide and talk about sort of what does this mean on the ground. So many folks may be aware, in the Canadian government context, you get policy coverage through a memorandum to cabinet that sets out the broad directions of what you're going to do, whether that's buying a ship or introducing a new program or whatnot. The formal budget process gives the money, and then you have a Treasury Board submission that releases the money to the departments with more context around what or how that money is going to be spent and how the monitoring is going to happen and so on. So the team that I work with and that we support the program sectors is incredibly involved in a wide range of costing initiatives. Again, big challenges is the difference between some of the smaller ones versus long-term multi-generational shipbuilding. And I'm going to ask Jason now to just walk through for a minute in terms of what and how we go through this process and the support to decision makers in terms of cabinet committees. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Roger. So I want to walk through a bit of a fictional example that hopefully illustrates a bit of how we would assess the credibility and robustness of cost estimates, as Roger outlined quite well earlier in the presentation. So as we're assessing cost estimates at the CCE, we're tending to look at things through a number of lenses. So we would start with essential characteristics. So these would be a common set of characteristics, things like whether the Government of Canada costing process was followed, if all the elements were estimated. So, question of comprehensiveness. We look at data as well. Data is a real focus of ours. Data-driven and evidence-based estimates are one of the keys to increasing credibility. On this note as well, subject matter expert opinion. It's acceptable in certain circumstances as a data source, but there are limitations with subject matter expert estimates that need to be understood and appropriately addressed. And this leads us to some of our other considerations, like risk and uncertainty, which I'll get to in a minute. We look as well at quality assurance and validation. This is a bit of a demanding exercise, and our capacity is limited. We're not as focused on the quality assurance piece. The CFO attestation plays a big role there, which Roger will get to at the next slide. But we do want to look at whether the estimate makes sense in context. So there's a validation exercise, that's often important for estimates. We look at planning as well. It takes time to develop credible cost estimates, and it requires quite a bit of engagement with stakeholders to make sure everything is understood. Risk and uncertainty analysis, this is another one of our key focuses. Risk and uncertainty needs to be assessed for cost estimates, and this should be the basis for contingency. Arbitrary sort of percentages for contingency really should be viewed as a last resort, not the go-to approach. We want contingency to be driven from risk and uncertainty analysis. And then on documentation, this is tied to planning, but we want to make sure that corporate knowledge isn't lost and that figures, ground rules, and assumptions can be clearly explained, not only now, but also in the future as questions come up about the estimate. I will note quickly as well, these lenses are reflected in the definitions for ROM, indicative, and substantive. They're related to getting expenditure authority. So I just want to walk through a quick example to kind of show how this might look like. So let's suppose that my sister is renovating her basement. She's wanting to put in an apartment, and she thinks it's going to cost $70,000. So she asked me, hey, Jason, can you put on your CCE cap and give me a sense of how good my estimate is? So the first thing I'd look at is essential characteristics. So this would lead to questions about how this estimate was put together. So she tells me, well, I want to renovate the basement. We're going to redo the floors, redo the walls, put in some bigger windows, put in some extra outlets, put in a kitchen. And while we're at it, we might as well replace my furnace and AC, which are a bit old. So how she came up with this estimate was she had a contractor walk through the basement with her, and the contractor said, well, it'll be about $50,000 to do, the basic renovation work. And then we don't do the furnace and AC ourselves, but we work with a company that does this all the time. It costs about $10,000. They did one for us last week, cost $10,000. So then my sister, she's looking at this 50,000 plus 10,000. So she has 60,000 kind of as a base, and she knows all sorts of things can happen. So she adds $10,000 just as a bit of contingency. So she has $70,000. So I understand a bit about how the estimate's constructed. I'm then curious about a bit more about, the estimate. So I'll ask a bit on the planning side. So asking questions about how much information did the contractor know about the estimate? So what was the content of their discussions? Did he have a clear idea of what she wanted? Does she even have a clear idea of what she wanted, so that, expectations are well communicated? Has she considered what might be required from the city in terms of approvals and costs for that? And, I kind of find out a bit about what kind of conversations they had and learn things. In this example, for instance, that she's not really sure exactly what she wants. She kind of wants to go through it a bit, and then she'll decide as she sees how things are coming together. So then I take a look a bit at data. And so really here, it's a basic estimate. There's two kind of main components. One is the $50,000 that the contractor said is, the basic renovation work. And then I start to think about that. I wonder, what is that based on? It's clearly high level. He's using things like about $50,000. He's obviously an expert, does this all the time, but is he being optimistic? Is he being pessimistic? What kind of assumptions lie behind that data source? In terms of the other component, which is $10,000 for furnace and AC, that data source feels a bit more reliable. So you have, a company that does this all the time, and then there's, it's about $10,000. So that's a stronger data source. But we have some questions about the contractor estimate of $50,000. So this leads me to questions about risk and uncertainty analysis. So I start to then ask questions. What uncertainties are there? So for instance, are you set on your flooring? Are you wanting the cheapest flooring possible? Do you want really you know, expensive, fancy flooring? Do you know what appliances you want in the kitchen? You know, what uncertainties exist on the risk side? You know, what if there's water damage? What if you discover there's problems with the foundations, you need to replace the foundation? And then what I'm starting to do is ask questions about how much those things would cost, to then take a look at the $10,000 of contingency she has, and to try to assess, you know, are the risks and uncertainties comfortably captured in that contingency amount that she's put together. Then the next question I'm curious about is more on the quality assurance validation side. The key question in this case would be, what have other people paid for basement renovations? Is there something similar we can look at, you know, as kind of to see, you know, are we in the right ballpark? Are we comfortable? And then on the documentation side, in the government, we need written documentation. In this fictional example, I think the spirit would be questions about what assumptions was the contractor making when he, you know, gave that estimate for $50,000 and maybe the $10,000 as well. So that's kind of how I would look at this estimate. The next question it leads to is, what are my recommendations? And I would say, well, in this case, one of your key issues is the $50,000 estimate from the contractor. You're not really sure what's behind it. So there's a few steps that she could take. One is trying to understand what assumptions the contractor made when they gave that estimate. Another would be to try to really take a look at risk and uncertainty analysis and try to get a better sense of, you know, how much extra contingency she might need based on the risks of the project. And then the third thing would be taking a look at some other renovations just to make sure, like, are we in the right ballpark? So that's a bit of how we would go about this. I'm sorry, there isn't a slide to go with this example. I see that in the chat. But now if we move back to the real world, the CCE reviews the complex projects in the government typically. So one of the key things we also rely on is the CFO attestation to do a bit of that as well for us. So I'll pass it back up to Roger to continue on from there.
Great, thank you. And proof that you know, every sibling needs a cost accountant in the family to help them with the renovations, right? Right, Jason? So in terms of the CFO attestation on the next slide, this really was one of the first key steps that we did with the costing center. And in fact, back in the day, we got a CPA controllership award for the team that pulled that together. And the reason why CFO attestation again was so important is we've had for years and had prior to that for years had an attestation where chief financial officers are expected to sign off on the submissions that are going through to cabinet. What the CFO attestation guideline did is it formalized what was expected across 6 assertions and then a concluding statement. And it really moved the chief financial officer organizations upstream. So what that meant was organizations that would be having, you know, in the program areas developing their costs would then come through to the chief financial officers who were the conduit to central agencies where the cabinet would approve or not approve the proposals. And they would be given, in fact, I can remember as being and I won't say which department, being a DCFO, where we were given, where we were asked to attest to a proposal, and they wouldn't share the proposal with us because it was moving so fast, it hadn't quite finalized, and there were some secret things in it that we really didn't need to know about, but we were needed to sign on. And of course, luckily my CFO and I both said, well, if we can't see it, then we can't attest to it. So then they showed it to us, and we had, you know, overnight to review and approve it. What this did is this really moved things forward so that CFOs were involved in sort of the initial scoping planning at the memorandum, the cabinet stage, at the you know, the rollout and development after money had maybe come through. You know, the key components again from the assertion perspective, the proposal. So is the proposal reasonably described? In other words, open, fair, transparent communication. In terms of the risks that have a financial implication, is the sensitivity of those written out? Is there clarity around any risk mitigation? Are the resources consistent with what those assumptions are and the costs associated with that reasonably calculated and explained. Funding, again, difference between what you actually have from a budget perspective versus what you actually have from a cost estimate are different, but you need to make sure if there's a huge gap, what's the long-term plan in terms of sustainability. If you roll the thing out and it's a capital asset and it has a long tail in terms of maintenance and upkeep, but you can't do it, you create other problems. You need to make sure all of those pieces in terms of the life cycle of an asset are considered. The fifth one is around the compliance with the broader financial management policy, and then of course controls are in place to make sure that the project is stays on target and is running properly. At the end of which there's a conclusion. The ideal one is, of course, that the financial information supports overall decision making, but could be I'm unable to determine that, unable to assess because things have moved so fast, or there are substantial financial risks and so on. All of which, again, and I think this is one of the things too that in the last few years we've spent a lot of time with the costing centers with cabinet submissions, is we have risky proposals when we start doing things like COVID, when we start doing things like building ships, bridges, new programs. There are huge implications and risks. There are times where maybe you just don't have enough information. If you don't have enough information from our perspective, you need to say that you don't have enough information. Doesn't mean that the decision will be held off. Doesn't mean that the decision will go. But the key thing is the decision makers have the information to make informed decisions. We also just recently completed, or have almost completed, an evaluation on this because it's been out for 5-6 years now. Some of the challenges that persist are around the disclosure of risks and how do we make sure that that's clear and transparent, and how that information works through the system and sort of tags along with the actual submission. And then another area too, of course, is which from a costing perspective comes into play a little bit, but more importantly for my government accounting folks, is the accrual profiles is one of the things that we need to figure out. To what extent, it's great to have a cash cost estimate. To what extent does that differ with an accrual profile, and to what extent has on some of these things they get very complicated, that being considered. For my my last slide is the ongoing challenges. So I, as the Assistant Controller General, as the inaugural Executive Director on the Costing Center, which, by the way, I wouldn't hire myself today to lead that organization because they have moved so far beyond where my capacities end. A lot of great work, and I know I've got a handful of folks here. Hats off to all them, all the people who came. I see Varenti's name on this stuff. Varenti, who came in for a period of time. All of the colleagues again, National Defense under Alan at PSPC, DFO, etc. And I'm probably missing a whole bunch of people, so I shouldn't have mentioned names. But have come and gone and helped formulate and as a community move forward with that. There still exist ongoing challenges, which is, of course, data. In terms of how do we strengthen access to data. Some of the stuff we're doing, Government of Canada does some wild and crazy things that is, from a Canadian's perspective, is critical to what it is we do, but not many other people are doing it. So where do you find the data to say that, to cross-reference and do some of these things? Quantification of risk and uncertainty is still a huge challenge. There's sophisticated techniques that are already being employed, but ongoing, as complex as projects become more complex, as getting into IMIT, it's a different type of complexity. It's a different rhythm. Continued development of the costing expertise in unique domains. So again, IMIT is one that's emerging and requires a different expertise than what to build a system is very different than building a ship, is very different than building an aircraft, is very different than building a Canadarm, etc. And then I think I'd like to conclude back sort of where my initial messages were in terms of some of the challenges going back to 2011 days with the F-35. Communication, communication, communication. And I think that's one of the core competencies that as costers we have to really work on and hone our skills, is communicating it clearly, being able to reconcile back behind the scenes, to what it is that where your numbers come from, so that if you're asked a question in one way versus another way, you can still explain to the person how you got from one answer to the other, so that you can make sure that senior decision makers are informed, have the information, because again, at the end of the day, for costing will never be the golden nugget that will give you the 100% right answer on any estimate. But what costing is, at least what we're trying to do with costing, is make sure that it helps inform decision making, so that people understand where the risks are, what the upside, what the likelihood is, and some of the impacts that may come if certain things come to fruition. So with that, I will wrap up the presentation. The last slide just has some contact information. As I said, these are the folks who truly know how to do this stuff, and at a much more sophisticated way than I ever would have known. But I want to thank you all, and I think we've got about 13 minutes for questions, if there's anything for either myself or Jason, or if it well, Jason probably can answer them all, but if Jason can't, then we always have Derek as well, who we can throw up on the screen as well. Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you to everyone else.
Yeah, thanks very much, Roger. And the good news, in real time, we've actually uploaded this presentation in English and French to the ICEAA website. So if people look in the chat bar, there's a link to that web page, and you'll be able to pull what Roger walked through today in both English and in French. So thank you to Alan Weldon, who did that in whilst we were chatting today. So that's where you'll be able to obtain this. So that's a good one. I did see a couple of questions in the chat bar. I think we address Crystal's live. I mean, I thought, Jason, the walkthrough, the way you described the basement renovation, really brought to life a number of those challenges. So I think Crystal might be at something there to say, well, maybe we should take your very well worked anecdote and develop it into something like a slide, because I think that is, as Roger points out, the ability to communicate is often telling a story and putting it into the real concepts of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and making sure you remember those golden rules and remember those steps in a way that can actually articulate that. So recognize that was hasn't happened yet, but I thought it was a very valid point from Crystal. The other question I've seen that's popped up, and maybe Jason would have a view on this. It was suggesting from Michael Hanlon that the CC is looking for examples of guidance, training, and tools developed in the departments. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier about your relationship with national defence, but maybe there's some advice or a way of leveraging a lot of the expertise that you're seeing growing up organically within the government of Canada.
Yeah, so I can speak to this. We are, so as Roger's kind of laid out, as we're looking towards more community engagement with outreach, one of the things we are hoping to do is, as we release guidance on best practices, to put up illustrative examples to actually bring to light some of how these core concepts get applied. As we do that, we also are very aware that the departments are all different, and so depending on your application, there's certain processes and techniques that national defense, for instance, would have to implement that really wouldn't be relevant. But back to the point of examples, we very much are looking to kind of build up some of those illustrative examples, really to support our guidance and leverage the expertise across the government.
Thank you for that. There's no other questions in the chat, but maybe I can ask one, and it's kind of going back to slide 6 when we talked about what's planned for releases this year. I wonder, Jason, you might be able to or Derek might be able to talk about what we can expect in the later stages of this year around how the community of practice might benefit from some of these planned and ongoing activities.
Yeah, so you can kind of see the list there. A lot of what's listed as complete is already up on our GCPD site if you take a look. The next big thing that we are working on is developing a new guide to costing. So we have a working group that's been established at the director and manager level. We have over 30 members from 14 departments participating in that working group. And we've been working through how we can strengthen the current guidance that exists. And so that's currently in the stage. If you look on our GCPD site, there is actually an outline up there. And shortly we have a finalized outline that will be posted as well. So you can take a look and see where the direction is. It's not departments that have already put in practice the 2019 guide aren't really going to be affected, because really this is just building on the objectives in that guide and trying to just make things clearer for departments. In terms of the rest, we are working in a bunch of different areas as well. And so you can see some of those. We're actively working on a piece on costing data, which will go into, how do you use data to drive estimates, and we're working on some activity-based costing guidance as well. And then we have lots planned, as you can see as well. So we're hoping really to really build up this guidance base over the next few years.
Thanks for that, Jason. And I see Nick Grodan has asked a question, so I'll read it out and maybe you can provide some thoughts around that one. So Nick has said, when he looks at international guidance and international consultancy firms, there's often a costing team that has a broad mix of disciplines and skill sets, including engineers, mathematicians, statisticians, accountants, and those with both finance, economic, and probably engineering backgrounds, I would add. And then there seems to be a move towards accountants, and he was wondering, does the Costing Centre of Expertise have an opinion and guidance around what might be in a well balanced, structured costing team? Have you any thoughts on that?
Sure. So let me again, Jason or Derek, welcome to step in. But so if you go back, actually, I remember the conversations that we had with Jim Ralston, who was the Controller General at the time, and his view was that we were going to have engineers, we were going to have the mathematicians, we were going to have some statisticians, and probably different engineers, depending on whether it was a ship or a plane. Obviously, the mechanics are quite different. And I think, from my perspective, where we've ended up is probably still along an evolutionary path. There's no question that when you look at the costing that's being done in departments, that there is a need for that type of expertise and competencies baked into those organizations. I also know, back when we created the Costing Center, my boss at the time, so Tom Scrimger, and I went down to Patuxent Air Force Base, looked at the F-35 costing, where they were, and again, a multidisciplinary, but a much larger, right? So my costing center at that time was, again, probably around a dozen people. Theirs was around 200, 250. So it depends on scale and scope. I think, the key thing is that those types of competencies need to be brought to the project. And I think that's sort of where we've ended up in a Canadian context, which is, as long as those competencies are brought in, whether they are sitting in the project team, sitting in the consulting side, somewhere along the path, the costing center and the teams that we've been building to do that costing challenge have the skills to ask the questions, to understand those areas well enough. Into the future, I think that's again an ongoing question, and something that we need to continue to ask ourselves. And from time to time, we do sort of go back and say, do we need to expand? Or, for example, as we get into IMIT, do we need to have, people who are truly, those computer science scientists type involved, and so on. But again, we're more, I would say, generalists. Although we are, the team is hyper specialists in terms of costing, generalists in terms of what it is they're doing with expertise in certain domains. But anyways, I've sort of rambled around the question with basically saying, right now that's not where we are, and I'm okay and I'm comfortable with where we are, but also acknowledging the fact that that is a very good question, and something that probably in the future needs to be investigated a little more again.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that, Roger, and I totally agree, and I think that is where you have some very, very major big projects. Well, because of their size, because of their uniqueness, there is probably a need to supplement with those occasional cost engineers and experts, and maybe those that are involved more of a data science background with the increasing levels of data involved. Another good question has come through to me, Roger, and it's building on one of your last summary points, which talks around communication. And I wonder, and this happens quite a lot, I wonder if you could give what sort of information would you expect or would think would be beneficial if you had to receive a 2-minute briefing around to a deputy head around costing? What are the sort of elements that you think would be highly valuable?
So the interesting thing is we do this on a regular basis. So before these big projects go in, we do brief the Controller General, who sits at Treasury Board. The team will brief me along the way, and again, I would turn to Jason in terms of maybe afterwards to hold me honest in terms of what it is. I can tell you, in terms of as a senior executive, I have full confidence, as I've said many times in my costing center. I'm not questioning their abilities. So I don't need to see, and I'll pick on poor Jason who's been doing this presentation. I don't need to see on each individual case how smart he is and how much he's dug into those things. To me, that's a given. It's what are the outliers? What are the pieces that are really the concern? And then also from a political perspective, what's the other side briefing? And where are those sticking points going to be? And once I know that, then I can dig in and try and go out a little bit deeper. And in terms of how I brief up, because I think that's how your question was, not briefing me, but as I brief up, that's exactly what I would do. Is I would go to Rock and say, Rock, here's the case. Everything's good. Pick on National Defense, because I've talked to them again, sent them lots of kudos. National Defense is this. This is their position. This is our position. We've worked it through. And at the end of the day, the last sort of thorny piece is this. Other than that, we're really good here, here, and here. We all agree that this is a problem, and this is the outlier. So I don't know in terms of if that sort of gets to what you were looking for, Daniel.
Yeah, and I think it's important and actually very, very timely, is that communication is being able to articulate very, very quickly what the salient points are, and also maybe telling the narrative about what to look out for in terms of that estimate. So that's absolutely right. I notice we're at time now, so I want to use the final minute to do two things. First of all, to thank Roger, Derek, and Jason for their time today, for the way they walked you through not just the update, but were able to provide some advice and some guidance on what we're doing today, but also open up to where this is going later this year and beyond. And that's my second point. There is resources available. I would encourage people to do two things. Look at the ICEAA website where you'll be able to take these presentations. And also there's a link to the GCpedia page that Roger and Jason referred to earlier. And then I will plug the ICEAA webinars will go on. We're trying to run these monthly or at least every other month, and we're looking for subjects which will increase the level of understanding within the Government of Canada and the costing community. And I'm hopeful that Roger and Derek and Jason enjoyed their time today, so we might invite them back, maybe in 6 to 9 months and get an update of how things have evolved since then. So with that, I would just like to offer one more of thanks. Getting over 100 people on a lunchtime to listen to this just shows the level of interest, the level of involvement, and the level of importance around this subject. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the call.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.